Hello there guys, and welcome to the complete settings guide for X-Plane 11. Many of you have been asking for this video ever since the release of the public beta version of X-Plane 11. Essentially what I'd like to show in this video is everything I do to get the results that I do. I'm going to show you my PC specs, nVidia control panel settings, and I'm going to include a few tips along the video, and we're finally going to jump into the sim and take a look at all the sliders and how they affect performance. In terms of PC specifications and operating system, I am using Windows 10 Pro 64-bit edition. The processor's Intel Core i7-7700K at a base clock of 4.2 GHz. We will be talking a little bit about overclocking in just a moment. I have a total of 64 GB of system RAM installed. In terms of the graphic card, I am using the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti with the latest nVidia drivers available at the time of making this video, which is 382.05. In terms of hard disk space, I've got a total of 3 drives, 2 of which are M.2 SSDs. Drive C hosts the operating system, and Drive D only hosts X-Plane 11 and P3D. In terms of the nVidia control panel settings, I am going to be focusing only on the settings that I have changed for X-Plane 11. The first being Anti-Aliasing FXAA. I've turned that on. It helps with the jagged lines. The second is the G-Sync, the monitor technology. And if you have a G-Sync enabled monitor, then my recommendation is to turn off VSync inside X-Plane. I've done extensive testing on this, and I found out that you get the best smoothness when VSync is disabled in the sim while G-Sync is enabled in the nVidia control panel. In terms of the multi-display, I'm using single display performance mode as I'm using a single monitor. If you are using multiple monitors, then of course, you should use the multiple display performance mode. In terms of power management mode, I have prefer maximum performance, and refresh rate, I'm using the highest available refresh rate. In terms of texture quality, I'm using high quality, and threaded optimization is off. Now, a quick thing on threaded optimization. I've done testing again with this quite a bit, and I've noticed absolutely no difference with threaded optimization on or off in X-Plane 11. And I know many of you have had issues with X-Plane 11 with threaded optimization on auto, but in my case, on this particular PC, I'm having absolutely no problems with threaded optimization on or off. Another thing that I've tested quite a bit is hyperthreading. So hyperthreading will give you an extra 4 logical cores. So I've got 4 physical and 4 logical, a total of 8. And again, with X-Plane 11, I don't really notice any performance change with hyperthreading on or off. In terms of the motherboard, I am using the Asus Maximus 9 Formula motherboard. It is one of the latest from Asus, and if you are using an Asus motherboard, then you can take advantage of the AI suite for all your overclocking needs. This is version 3, and it is the latest version available at the time of making this video. The nice thing about AI Suite is that it gives you the ability to overclock everything with a single button. It gives you some useful information about voltage, about temperature, fan speeds. And just a quick thing on overclocking. If you're going to overclock, you will get you will notice a difference in a 0.5 increment overclock. So what that means, if you're at a base clock of 4.0 and you overclock to 4.2, the difference in performance is going to be negligible. So it's always to go to 4.5, and you will get a substantial increase in performance from 4 to 4.5. Again, if you are at a 4.5 base clock and you just go to 4.7, then the change in performance is again going to be negligible. I've done a lot of testing on the Kaby Lake, and with the settings, with the voltage settings I have right now, and this is the XMP profile, I can go up to 4.7 gigahertz without changing anything and keeping my temps very, very low. If you want to go to a higher clock speed, you can do so, and you can come over here and you can change the settings. As you can see here, it's very easy to just go group tuning, and we'll go to 4.6 gigahertz and just say apply and say yes, and that's it. Let us now take a look at how the various X-Plane 11 settings affect performance. I'm going to be approaching this settings guide in a slightly different manner. I will be using my current settings as the baseline. I've turned off XEnviro and deleted all cloud and wind layers. I've set the visibility to maximum, and we're currently situated at Los Angeles International Airport in the United States. I've picked Los Angeles, and by the way, this is the default airport in X-Plane 11, simply because it is a large airport with a fair amount of buildings. The area around Los Angeles is quite dense, and it offers good distribution of tree versus objects versus roads, and the terrain distribution in this area is ideal for this kind of testing, as we have some mountains, some flatland, as well as some water bodies. We are going to be using the Airfoil Lab Cessna 172 for all the tests that we're going to be conducting in this video. The reason I picked the Airfoil Lab Cessna is that it's an aircraft that is very heavy on system resources. A quick performance tuning tip before we begin our testing today is that when you're doing your FPS testing, make sure that you test your settings at different camera views. And what I mean by this is the following. So right now we're getting about 46, 47 frames. And watch what happens now. We're getting now 51 or 50 frames. And as we move the camera, the FPS counter is showing different results, okay? And make sure that you hit the lowest point. So this is now 40 frames. And this is going to be a good reference for us to use for testing. The first test that we're going to do today is the reflection test. And we are getting now about 41, 42 frames. And of course, as you can see, we are not getting any wave reflection whatsoever. And we're not getting any reflection of the mountains here on the water body. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to change the reflection detail to low. And my experience is that this actually does nothing. You know, it will impact performance a bit. So we went down from 42 to about 39. So 3 frames overall loss in performance, and it gives you absolutely nothing in terms of visuals. So as you can see here, the wave reflections are still not there, and there is no reflection of the mountains whatsoever. And of course, during nighttime, you'll get absolutely nothing. Okay, so let's change it to nighttime. There you go. As you can see, you can't even tell that this is actually a water surface. So 3 FPS loss for absolutely nothing. Okay. Now we're going to go to medium settings. And by the way, I'm not sure why there is medium 1 and medium 2, and then there is high and maximum. But on the medium setting, we are now at 32 frames. Look at that, 10 FPS loss. Okay. But we are now getting the nice reflection of the wave reflections. So it's starting to look like water. And if we go to this part of the scene, as you can see now, we have the reflections of the mountains. Let's see if we get anything during nighttime. So if I change it to nighttime again, there is absolutely nothing there. No reflection of the lights on the water body at this setting. So let's go back to daylight. And now we're going to go to medium 2. All right. And in terms of FPS, we're getting about the same so far, 32, 33 FPS. The reflection of the, the buildings, the objects' reflection on the water is more prominent now. And the same thing we're getting here, the reflection of the mountains. And let's check nighttime and see if that changes anything. And yes. So now we're getting a little bit of the water reflection on the water here. So you can see the it makes for a very, by the way, very nice approaches into airports. Okay, so it's looking pretty good, and the FPS is about what, 34 frames. So it's looking okay, and we'll change it here to daylight. And we're getting about 30. I think this is a reasonable setting for the reflections. By the way, if you go to, for some reason, if we go to the maximum, okay, we're getting now about 36, 35 frames. So frame rate hasn't been affected. But look at this. I'm not sure why this is, and this has been. Since, okay, you can see it more clearly now. You get this kind of, I'm not sure what to call this, but this is a problem that I've noticed in X-Plane 11 ever since the beta release, and it still hasn't been fixed. But in terms of the FPS, we're getting, decent FPS at 33 frames, and during nighttime, and as you can see also the reflection now. The wave reflection looks pretty good, and during nighttime, again you'll get this really nice reflection of the lights on the water, and this makes for a very convincing approach during nighttime. The next test that we're going to do is the number of world object settings test. And if you're coming from X-Plane 10, you will notice that Luminar Research has done some changes in terms of the graphics settings. So in X-Plane 10, we used to have 4 sliders to sort of set the scene. We had the trees slider, number of world objects, the number of roads, and traffic, meaning the cars and trucks on the street. So you have to bear in mind that when you're moving your slider to the right, you're increasing a total of 4 sliders. You're increasing your trees, you're increasing your objects, buildings, roads, and the traffic. So that will have definitely a very large effect on FPS. Okay. Now I've done a lot of testing, and for my preference, I found out that the high setting is the best setting. Now I can go to maximum, but it would have to be at the expense of other sliders. And this is really, to my preference, this is the best thing for me. But let's go ahead now and move the number of world objects to the maximum setting, and let's see what effect we get on FPS. So we're getting about 42, 43, and I'm going to move this all the way to maximum, and let's see what happens. So now we have the number of world objects set to maximum, and as you can see, there are a lot more trees, a lot more buildings, and more traffic, and we are at about 35, 34 frames from 43 frames. So about 9 frames lost again. And now as I move the scene here, look at that. Now we're getting to about 29. Remember in the beginning of the video I told you to test from various camera angles, and look at that. Now we're getting about 29, 28, which is still okay, I guess. Okay, so this is about 29 frames. Let's change this to nighttime. Okay, and now look at that. Now we're getting about 25 frames. Okay, so that's pretty low. 25 is still flyable, but it's not very smooth. Okay, 27, yeah. So of course this is Los Angeles area, and this area is very dense, so it really is going to depend on where you're going to fly. So you can probably still max this slider if you're flying in a less dense area. But again, if you're going to fly into, you know, airports like JFK or Los Angeles or Seattle, then probably you're going to have to, you know, tone down your number of world object settings. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the settings back. I'm going to leave the scene exactly where it is now, and we're going to change it back to the previous settings to see how much difference we get during nighttime as well. So let's come back here and let's put this back on high and say done. So as you can see, we are now back to about 38, 39 frames from 25 frames, 24 frames. So as you can see, the difference in performance is quite significant. And of course, this is because, remember, it's all four sliders being pushed all the way to the right. And traffic is one thing that I know affects FPS quite a bit. And personally, I would have preferred to have at least those four sliders in X-Plane 11. Normally, what I used to do in X-Plane 10 is I used to have all four sliders at max. All three sliders at max, with the exception of the traffic slider. I had it at minimum, and you'd still get, you know, nice traffic. You'd still see the cars driving around, but without the you know, the huge FPS hit. So we're getting about 38 frames from 25. We're talking about somewhere between 13 to 14 FPS total loss. Okay, let's switch over here. Remember, this is where we used to get 25 frames with the number of rolled objects set to maximum, and now we're getting about 34, so 9 FPS difference. Again, significant. The next test that we're going to do is the HDR test. We are now getting about 40 frames, and let's go ahead and bring up the tab. Now, I have the HDR setting at high, so let's put this on maximum. And by the way, did you notice what happened here? So this is the normal, and this is, I hope you can see what's happening in terms of the shadows. So if I say done, look at the frames. 23 versus 43, that's about 20 frames loss, moving from high setting for HDR to maximum. And this is a significant drop in performance, which I don't think it justifies the visual gain that you get in terms of the eye candy. It makes the shadows a bit more defined in some areas, and I think you can, with something like reshade, get the same effect with a lot less FPS hit. So, but this setting is to me is obsolete because it just simply renders the sim unflyable. And I'm not sure that all of you guys can see the difference. The difference is very subtle, by the way. So if I bring this back here, if you can just notice the areas where there is some shadow, I think you can see what it's doing. So we put it back here. You see how things are more defined? And if I bring it back here, then you lose those little details here, which, in my opinion, is really not worth it. What I've done now is I've changed the HDR slider to medium, and when you do so, you will lose a lot of the visual effects, including anti-aliasing features of X-Plane 11. Now, X-Plane was meant to be used with HDR, but let me show you what happens when you go to medium settings. First, we do have some increase in performance. So we had about 42 FPS, and we're about at 46, 47, so about 4 to 5 FPS increase when turning HDR off. But the amount of shimmering that you can see, okay, as we move away, look at the shimmering all over the place. The jagged lines here, as you can see, it doesn't really look good at all right now. And what happens is the beautiful night lighting of X-Plane completely disappears. Look at that. That looks just, you know, mediocre. Doesn't look good at all. Doesn't really have that realistic look. And the reason is X-Plane was meant to be used with HDR. When it comes to texture quality, it is important to understand that while compressing textures reduces visual quality, it can also reduce the amount of VRAM required to run the sim significantly. And what I do normally is I run at the maximum setting without compression, because just the visual quality is so much better, in my opinion. The sharpness of the scene, the pronunciation of colors, everything just really looks a lot sharper. But it may not be an option for all of you guys. So if you have a low to mid-range graphic card, you might want to compress the textures, as it will help really with the frame rate. And just on frame rates, graphic cards, and texture quality, just let me say the following. If you have a high-end graphic card, a Titan X, whether it's the Pascal or the Maxwell architecture, or if you have the 1080 Ti, if you have any graphic card with more than 8 GB of VRAM, then you shouldn't really have any problem. And switching between those cards probably will not increase your FPS, while the newer cards may allow you to run other games and see different features in other games. Particularly in X-Plane, you're not really going to see an increase in FPS. Okay, if you are, of course, using a 760 that has only 3 gig of VRAM, then definitely compressing textures is a must, and upgrading to a card with more VRAM will definitely increase FPS. Next, let us take a look at the anti-aliasing settings. And the best way to test anti-aliasing is while the aircraft is up in the air and moving around an area where there are a few buildings, because the shimmer is not really going to show while the aircraft is stationary. So if you look here, if we look at the scene here, I'm getting about 41 frames. And if we change this all the way down to here, 2 times SSA and FXAA, and say done, as you can see, nothing changed. The frames are still the same. We're still getting about 40 frames. So what we're going to do is we're going to get up in the air and take a look at the anti-aliasing settings. All right, we are now up in the air, and as you can see, there is a minimal amount of shimmering. Everything looks pretty smooth right around this area here. And we have a good amount of buildings and trees to test. So we are getting now 32 frames, and let's go ahead and change this to 2. Oops, right there. All right, now we're getting about 37 frames, but look at the shimmering. Okay, you can see the shimmering right there. Now this is less pronounced during nighttime, but it is something that I just completely dread. And I just can't really fly the sim with all this shimmering. So if we go to FXAA only, now look at that. Look at the shimmering. By the way, performance hasn't really been affected that much, but the shimmering is just terrible. Yeah, still pretty smooth, but you know, that doesn't look good. So we're going to go back and put this on 4 times FX, 4 times SSAA, and now you've got the shimmers are reduced but are still there. You can see them. And now we'll go to 4x SSAA and FXAA, and now this is very reasonable again. Good frames, 36 frames. You can still see the shimmers, but they're not as pronounced. And then this is the setting that I have, which is the maximum setting, which almost eliminates the shimmers and gives you a very smooth experience at, of course, lesser frames. So we've got about 4 frames loss when we move to the maximum. Just a quick thing on anti-aliasing settings. If you're using a 4K monitor, you will probably not need as much anti-aliasing to get rid of the shimmering and the jagged lines, simply because the scene is being rendered at a much higher resolution. And just through some testing, I found out that an ideal settings for a 4K monitor is 2x SSA plus FXAA. You will get the same results that I'm getting on my monitor at this particular settings. So you can save some FPS in terms of anti-aliasing, but then of course you're going to still lose some FPS because you're running at a higher resolution. So all in all, I think you will get the same FPS if you're running at a 4K monitor with the 2x SSAA and FXAA. So you will get about 31, 32 frames with exactly the same aircraft and settings. Many of you have asked me in the past if the field of view actually affects performance. And my answer is yes and no. And the reason why I say yes and no is that in the technical sense, changing the field of view is going to affect performance simply because your GPU is working more to display a larger area. Now, the reason why I say no, it doesn't, is because the actual impact is very negligible within the range that we flight simmers use. So from 60 to about 85 degrees of field view, your performance is probably not going to be affected. And if it does, it's probably going to be like 1 FPS. And this is something probably that we can simulate here. So we are at 70 degrees and we're getting about 53, 52, 53 frames, okay? So if I go to 85 degrees, as you can see, the performance hasn't changed. I am now at 52, 53 frames. But if I change the field of view to 170 degrees, then look at what happens to the frames. So I've lost about, 4 and 3, about 7 frames, moving from 70 degrees to 170 degrees. And this is simply because the GPU has to work harder. Now, if we go to 60 FPS, so we went from, there we go. So again, as you can see, now we're getting 53, 54. So maybe 1 FPS increase, which in my opinion is negligible. My preferred field of view is 70. I think it gives me a good field of view for most aircraft in X-plane. But of course, it's always up to you to decide what really is your preferred field of view. There are a couple of things that I'd like to also touch base on before we conclude our settings guide today. One is the draw parked aircraft and the other is draw shadows on scenery. Now this option here, draw parked aircraft, doesn't really have that much of an effect on performance unless you have a really low-end graphic card with like 3 gig of VRAM and it's already, near maxing out in terms of available VRAM, then it might be a limiting factor. But generally speaking, you can tick this option without any problem. Now, draw shadows on scenery, on the other hand, is a frame eater. So if we go to data, let me bring up the FPS counter again. Now, what we're getting right now in this scene, and we're still around the Los Angeles area, okay, so we are getting about 41 frames. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw shadows on scenery, and let's see what happens to the FPS. Reduction in FPS is about 9 to 10 FPS. It's my recommendation that if you want to turn this option on, then reduce the number of rolled objects, as the shadow, drawing shadow on scenery will draw the shadow on every object that is loaded in the scene. That includes all the trees, the lights, the objects, buildings, cars, everything. So it will definitely tax the FPS quite significantly. Well, captains, this brings us to the conclusion of the complete settings guide for X-Plane 11. I sure do hope that you have enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you. I sure do hope that it's been a useful and informative video. Until next time, please take care of yourselves and each other. I will see you all very soon. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.